This is Jeremy Bassetti, and you're listening to Travel Writing World, a podcast featuring interviews with travel writers about their work and about the business and craft of travel writing. You can find the episode show notes, free travel writing resources, and much more at travelwritingworld.com. In her journey through Central Asia, Caroline Eden uses food as a platform from which to explore the history and culture of this underreported region, a land on the old Silk Road and at the crossroads of East and West. Caroline stops by the podcast to talk about the stands, their food, and her new book, Red Sands, now available in a beautiful hardback stuffed with reportage, photographs, and recipes. So now, here is Caroline Eden. Caroline, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jeremy.
So in 2018, you published Black Sea. It's a book about food and your travels through the Black Sea region, so Odessa, Romania, and Turkey. But that was well received and won many awards. And now you're back with what has been described as the second book in a trilogy. A new book called Red Sands about your travels through Central Asia. So I was wondering if you could just introduce us, tell us a little bit about what you have cooking here in this new book.
Yeah, thank you. So it's been out. It's a new book. It came out in November, both in the US and the UK. And it was really a way for me to try and see the region with new eyes. So I've been writing about Central Asia for just over a decade. Everything from travel articles to sort of more newsy radio reports, book reviews. I love the region very much. My husband was based there for quite a long time as a foreign correspondent. So the two of us are very, very fond of this region. But I wanted to go back and look at it really through food and see how that forges and shapes the landscape and reflects the history, and to maybe use it as a test to see how it can open doors to other lives and other worlds that maybe I hadn't seen before. So really it was a way for me to see it anew and to try and record the changes I'd witnessed over these years of traveling to and from Central Asia, because while many things stay the same, there is definitely a march of modernization in the big cities. So I also wanted to capture some of that before more things changed.
Mm-hmm. And so we're talking here about these stands, the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and curiously, not Turkmenistan, right?
Right, yeah. I pondered long and hard about this, and it felt wrong to me to leave Turkmenistan out. However, it's very difficult there to report freely and independently. You're technically supposed to have a guide if you leave the capital, Ashgabat. And while I've got some contacts there and I maybe could have pulled some strings, what I like to do is to take my time and sort of float about and just talk to people freely. And I was a bit concerned that Turkmenistan, which is really under a dictator, wouldn't allow me to do that. So I decided to leave it out. It wasn't an easy decision, but I felt it was the best decision to make at this time.
Mm-hmm. So you'd mentioned that both you and your husband are fond of this region. I'm just curious, what is so fascinating about it, or what is so fascinating about this region's food?
So there's two things really. Initially for me, I traveled a lot in the Indian subcontinent, and I was drawn there mainly for the architecture. I mean, also to trace the Silk Road and the history. But I was fascinated by the mixture of Islam and the Soviet hangover which exists, and it's a curious mix, and it produces very interesting cultural. I wouldn't say clashes, because things don't clash; they're quite smooth. And the food for me, book-wise, was a way to try and highlight these differences and similarities. And I got quite frustrated because in many guidebooks, people talk about how challenging the food is. And if you're vegetarian, you're going to have a nightmare and you're going to be hungry. And this wasn't really my experience. I don't eat very much meat, and I'd never gone hungry in Central Asia. The markets are full of incredible produce, some of the best fruit in the world, amazing vegetables, herbs, cheeses, breads, very good meat, actually. And so Samarkand, my very first book, which was published back in 2016, was a sort of antidote to that. It was a way for me to try and right that wrong and to say that this isn't really true. Yes, tourism's not established, so some of the tourism sort of orientated cafes and restaurants are not so great. But actually, if you stay in people's homes, the cooking's really interesting because people draw on the entire former Soviet Union, which is very varied and complex.
I'm glad you mentioned the Silk Road connection because it was something I wanted to ask you about. This region is a crossroads, right? The Silk Road, of course, went through the area, Samarkand, Tashkent, and in more modern times, Russia and China, the obvious influence of the Soviet Union, which you mentioned, and China, perhaps because of the Uyghur population that are moving into the region because of the persecution in China. Can we see this like strong cross-fertilization, I guess, of in the cuisine? Is it something tangible? Is something that we can mark?
Yes. I mean, if we take the Uyghurs in particular, they've been settled in China for a very long time. And there's a very large diaspora in Almaty in Kazakhstan. Many of the Uyghurs who live in Xinjiang are ethnically Kazakh. Some Kyrgyz, very few Uzbeks. And Uyghur food is still very popular in Central Asia. So in Bishkek, for example, there's a great cafe called Cafe Pfizer. And it was opened by Kyrgyz Uyghur people a while ago, maybe 20 odd years ago. And it's excellent. And you go there and you have lagman. And this is sort of noodles with a meat broth, celery and red peppers, and meat and chopped chives on the top. It's very, very popular. So the Uyghur food definitely exists in the pockets of the diaspora, which exist in Almaty in Kazakhstan and Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. In the book, I have an essay where I go to have an iftar feast during Ramadan with a Uyghur population in Almaty at a mosque. And there I talk about the current problems which are happening across the border in China, the cultural / possibly genuine genocide of the Uyghur people, which continues to the world's horror. So food, I think people sometimes think it's quite a frivolous topic, but it isn't, because you can talk about anything through food. Adventures in understanding the microscopic to the monumental, the universal and the particular. There's if you talk about food, there's always interesting routes that it takes you on, and the Uyghur story is just one of them. I'm very pleased that now the media is picking up on this story, but it's not new. It's been happening for 20 odd years.
Now that you mentioned that, I think I phrased my question incorrectly. I mentioned the Chinese influence, and I guess conflated Chinese with Uyghur. But as you note, many of the Uyghurs there are ethnically not Chinese. So
no, they're Turkic. They speak Turkic language and they're Muslims. But you're right about the Chinese influence. It's huge in Central Asia, and the Russian and Chinese sort of battle for power is very interesting in itself. So China bankrolls a lot of the major infrastructure projects in Central Asia, tunnels, dams, very sort of basic, important infrastructure, but it gets the countries into a lot of debt. And Tajikistan, for example, is a grindingly poor country, and it is extremely in debt to China. Conversely, Russia, people always say to me, what languages do you speak? And I'm not a linguist. It's always very disappointing for me and for whoever asks the question. But I do speak some Russian, and Russian is still the language you hear in Bishkek on the streets, in Almaty on the streets, in Tashkent on the streets. Russia still looms large. And, if there's sort of international football matches happening, the locals in Central Asia are backing Russia. So it's very interesting, the Chinese-Russian sort of, battle for power and influence in Central Asia. It's one of the reasons that Central Asia is so important.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the Chinese coming in and building the roads and the infrastructure and, indebting many of these nations. It reminds me of the role that the World Bank and the IMF played and perhaps still plays about development and the processes of underdevelopment and development, bankrolling these nations and exerting some sort of power over them because of the debt. It's really fascinating to see that. And I hear that China is doing that in Africa as well and other parts of the world.
Oh, yeah. Yes, very much so. Yeah. I think Central Asia and certain countries in Africa have definitely crop up in news stories about countries which are very heavily in debt to China.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you wanted to reveal a different portrait of Central Asia. How has Central Asia been represented? Do you when you say that you wanted to reveal a different portrait of Central Asia, do you mean in terms of your approach to food and culture, or in terms of a larger narrative of Central Asia as being kind of like this, bleak space people fly over?
Yeah, I think I mean that from various different ways. There are very good websites on Central Asia that are available, news websites such as EurasiaNet, which tell very original, interesting stories about the region. So we have that. It's all quite serious, hard news, though. And then you have the sort of historical, slightly Orientalist, Great Game, Silk Road stories, many of which were written in the 20th century, mainly by male travel writers. So you have that sort of like slightly Orientalist gaze stuff coming through. And then you have the kind of wacky side of things, which are generally on travel blogs where people talk about, the crazy dictators and the terrible food and the terrible roads and none of the ATMs work. And none of this is... I mean, the EurasiaNet is a great site, but the other sort of stuff, the Orientalist stuff and the kind of wacky Central Asia, most of us who work in the region a lot are a bit fed up with that because it's not really true. The capital cities are very vibrant and very interesting and are doing quite a lot of cool cutting edge stuff. This doesn't tend to get reported on as much. So I suppose my book is supposed to just be an honest story in telling the story of Central Asia, how I experience it, hopefully with engagement and respect. And just sort of trying to catch the feel of the place in an honest way. And I felt that recipes and food is a really good way into introducing people who perhaps aren't so familiar with the region, to bring them in and, to show them the Central Asia that I've loved for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about the recipes in the book. This is the book, first of all. It's hard for me to convey this in audio, but the book is beautiful. It's, loaded with beautiful full-color images. There's heft to this book, right? And it's a travel book, but it doesn't read like a travel book per se because there are recipes and, there's a lot going on. And, I guess the question is like, how do you see this book and your previous books? Do you see them as travel journalism, food writing, cookbooks? How do you see your work?
They're really hard to classify. I mean, people always say, are you a food writer or are you a travel writer or like what are you? And I'm just like, well, I'm a writer. Like any writer, I find what I find is of interest. I suppose if I had it my way, I would say that it's a travel log with recipes, but they're essays through the book. I mean, really, I'm a journalist, so I quite like writing in 2,000 word chunks. So they're essays. Ideally, it's read from start to finish. There is a narrative arc of sorts going through it. So, and the recipes are there to sort of punctuate the text. And I've always said that I see them like maps. They're connectors and another way of telling the story, and they kind of help get people into the region. So, that's kind of how I see the recipes.
Mm-hmm. Are the recipes kind of indicative of the culture of the region, or are they more of kind of like waypoints on your journey while reporting and writing?
It's a good way of putting it. They're definitely waypoints on my journey. And I always like to make this clear. I am not from the region. I am probably not best placed to be writing a kind of anthropological study, an authentic study of cuisine in Central Asia. That's not my job. My job is to write recipes which express the journey. So they have to have a reason for being there. Mm-hmm. So, for example, for your listeners who probably won't have the book, in the Tajikistan essay, which is at the end, there's a region called the Fan Mountains, which is a wonderful region for trekking. And I'd been there, and then I sort of traveled north up to Hojand, which is in the Fergana Valley. And I'd become accustomed in the Fan Mountains and in Hojand with these lemons, which Americans will know as Maya lemons, those who know about food. We can't get these in the UK. They're very smooth. The skin's sort of smooth like a plum. And inside, the lemon is not fully sour. It's quite sweet, almost like an orange or a tangerine. Alice Waters, who was the owner of Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, used that citrus fruit in a very famous lemon meringue pie she made. I subsequently found out, well, Maya lemons come from China originally. Maya was the name of the guy who brought them from China to America. And these lemons that I was eating in Tajikistan are a variety of the Maya lemon. And the Tajiks use them to sort of dash them through pilaf, rice dishes with beef, so savory dishes. They'll put little chunks of the lemon in, and they sell them in all the markets, and they put them in salads. And I'd never experienced anything like this before. I've never eaten a salad with, little triangles of lemon in, because here they're so sharp and sour that just wouldn't work, but it worked there. So I have a recipe for Seven Lakes pilaf with beef and lemon, and it's the pilaf that I was served when I was trekking in the Fan Mountains, and I tell a little bit of a story about these lemons. So yeah, that's an example of how a recipe can work to tell something of the region. And the essay before it goes into great detail about this walk that I did that was wonderful, and the fabulous homestay that I stayed in.
Just a quick note, and we'll get right back to the episode. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app, or consider supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at travelwritingworld.com/support. So imagine you just ate this wonderful dish with the lemons. What do you do? Do you go to the cook and say, "Hey, this recipe is great. I want to copy it down"? Or how do you approach that?
It's a real mixture. I mean, it totally depends on the recipe. I know how to make a beef pilaf. It's not rocket science. So I don't think I spoke to the cook about that particular recipe. I just recreated it at home. Sometimes, obviously, there are certain ingredients which are quite hard to source at home. So you have to make things suitable for cooks in America, mainly, and the UK, where my readers tend to be. But yeah, sometimes I'll talk to the person in the restaurant or the guest house or the cafe, which I've been in. But more often than not, I just come home and I recreate it myself.
So I have your book in front of me, and it's loaded with a lot of interesting recipes. Which one is your favorite, or which one should I try first?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. We've just had great fun on Twitter doing the Great Central Asian Bake Off. So to promote the book, a friend of mine who promotes tourism to Uzbekistan and I did this competition where people had to photograph, obviously we can't taste it, but photograph Central Asian bakes. And I don't think we did this one, we did a different one, but throughout Central Asia, samsa is a quintessential thing that you eat. It's basically a pastry turnover, normally filled with lamb or pumpkin or potatoes. And it's super easy to make and really, really delicious. So a little twist on that, one recipe that's in the book, Dushanbe is the capital of Tajikistan. And there they don't call it samsa, they call it sambusa. And much to my excitement, they have chickpea versions, which are vegetarian. And often in the springtime, they fill them with herbs, spinach, mint, that sort of thing. So I have a recipe in there for Dushanbe sambusa with chickpea, spinach, and mint. You really can't go wrong with this recipe.
Okay.
Even if you never cook, it's lovely and flaky and buttery and very easy to make. So I would say as a starting point, this is probably a good thing because you will eat samsa or sambusa if you're in Central Asia. And this recipe tells you how to make it at home.
I'll surprise my wife with that dish.
Yeah, no, very good with a nice pot of green tea, which cuts through the fat if you're having lamb ones traditionally. But yeah, great thing to make for lunch with a salad.
So how did you first get involved with writing about food and culture?
I was doing sort of straightforward travel articles for various publications. I've been writing the odd piece for The Guardian, for example, for years. And I found that probably a third of each article that I ever wrote, whether I was in Haiti or Bangladesh or Nepal or Australia or wherever else, was about markets or food. And it's like that with travel journalism. If you read a lot of travel journalism, like I'm sure you do, it's an easy way into a culture if you don't understand anything. So if you're, it's not so fashionable to do this kind of journalism anymore, but back then, I would go to somewhere for 3 weeks and, you go to the local market and you get a very good initial feel for a place. And that's all fine. But if you can really get into a region like Central Asia, it's just a really, really good way of understanding somewhere. And I just find food gives me a sort of structure to write about whatever I might find interesting in a country. It's a nice, it's a structure, really, I think.
Does it help?
That's why I enjoy it.
Sorry, does it help with contacts and reporting? Does that open doors for you? Does that make it easier to?
Not really, but I think we all eat 3 times a day, so you're always going to be in a cafe or a restaurant. And Central Asia isn't always the easiest place to travel in. It is quite tiring. It is quite hard sometimes, and the roads are rough. And it's a comfort on these long journeys. And that's something I really talk about in Red Sands. You have to stop and you have to digest, and food provides a rhythm. It's 3 times a day you sit down and you think about things and you meet people. And that lovely domestic detail often opens up sides of history or lives which maybe you'd missed when you were sort of like whipping through somewhere. So it's a comfort and it's good to think with. It's a really good way to sit and digest what's happening.
I read somewhere that this is the 3rd book in your Colors trilogy. So Black Sea, Red Sands. What's next?
Well, obviously, Jeremy, at the moment, it's extremely hard to plan anything. So I can't divulge that. There will be a 3rd in the Colour trilogy, but goodness, at the moment, as you know, it's just so hard to put plans and wheels in motion. So I'm hoping autumn next year I can get on the road again, but the former Soviet Union is my area of interest, so I can probably say that much. We'll be sticking to the Russian speaking world.
I've seen your publication list and it seems like you're putting out a book about every 2 years or so, and this pandemic might ruin your rhythm, but we look forward to seeing something new.
Thank you.
Can you read us a short passage from Red Sands?
It would be my pleasure. So we were talking earlier on about what to do, and I said what I think might be nice is to take your listeners to Kazakhstan and to the giant steplands of central Kazakhstan and to a city called Karaganda. So I'm just going to read, and it will sound odd at the start, but then the essay will start to make sense. It is I, seagull. I see the horizon. This is the earth. How beautiful it is. Everything goes well. And with these words, on the 16th of June, 1963, 26-year-old Valentina Tereshkova made history by becoming the first woman in space. Aboard Vostok 6, strapped to her ejection seat, Tereshkova blasted into space, her mission lasting 2 days and 22 hours. So secretive was her quest, the space race between Cold War rivals, the Soviet Union and the United States was on, that her mother, back home in the Soviet Union, only knew of her daughter's success when she saw the television news. Chaika, meaning seagull in Russian, was her code name. Tereshkova's photograph hangs above the reception desks of Hotel Chaika in Karaganda. Its main building shapes like the spread wings of a gull, its design brilliantly retro. In the portrait, she poses serenely, under perfectly coiffed auburn hair, her black jacket shining with dozens of medals. Next to her, a framed portrait of Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, in exactly the same pose, highly decorated with even more medals, and with an even wider grin. Soviet heroes both. Men and women of the future. Unmissable at the front desk too is a diploma from 1987, proudly framed alongside the space superstars. From the Federation of Cosmonauts of the USSR, it was awarded to the Hotel Chaika on the 25th anniversary of the first R&R stay of space travelers, acknowledging the hotel's role as part of the Soviet space program. Quite fairly, the hotel continues to trade on its association with the cosmonauts. Dozens of cosmonauts came here to the city's first hotel, then simply called New Hotel, to sleep and rest after landing by parachute relatively close by. They'd gone up from Baikonur Cosmodrome in the south of the country, a spaceport set in 4,200 square miles of semi-desert, from where Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, and Vostok 1, the first human spaceflight, were both launched. A little R&R before the universal fame that followed. These cosmonauts turned Karaganda into a space city of sorts. Streets are named after them, spaceship murals decorate the side of apartment blocks, and in the center of Karaganda, a huge, shining steel Yuri Gagarin statue is the centerpiece in a monumental Soviet-built square. In Hotel Chaika's restaurant, flavors and tastes are little changed since the time the cosmonauts were here. The menu lists forschmack, a pate of herring and apple, Russian Olivia salad, stuffed pancakes, chicken julienne with mushrooms, and Georgian-style chicken. To drink, there are three choices: tea, juice, or vodka. As Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space, he ate the first meal in orbit too, thrilling in its blandness. 2 servings of pureed meat and 1 of chocolate sauce, pastes he squeezed into his mouth from tubes. Project Gemini, during the 1960s, improved freeze-drying methods, making it possible shrimp cocktail, toast, chicken, and vegetables with food coated with gelatin or oil to prevent crumbling. For space flights, Russians took fish such as sturgeon and cottage cheese like tvorog. When China launched into orbit in 2003 for the first time, astronaut Yang Liwei brought herbal tonics and Chinese-made bite-sized chicken and rice coated in a thin edible film for ease of eating. The caretaker of the hotel, Galim, led me to the adjoining mansion, which once stood alone as the original hotel. We crunched down a path over pine cones to the place where the heroes of the Soviet Union once slept. Plaques commemorating the spacemen and women covered the exterior wall, while inside, by white ruffled net curtains, were dozens of mounted portraits, more museum than hotel. Cosmonaut Vladimir Shatilov, twice hero of the Soviet Union, recipient of 3 Orders of Lenin, slept here on the 17th of January 1969. At 7 a.m. that morning, when it was minus 30 outside and the steppe was blanketed with 80 centimeters of snow, Shatilov touched down Soyuz 4, a few dozen miles southwest of Karaganda. 5 minutes after landing, he and his crew were on the recovery helicopter. Then, at Hotel Chaika, they underwent a medical examination before giving a press conference. I didn't stay at the Chaika, overnighting instead at the Hotel Cosmonaut, a 10-minute drive away. Little of the original 1972 construction remains, but this hotel too was built specifically for the return of cosmonauts.
I think the listeners will notice that this book isn't just about food. There's interesting stories, some fun and quirky like this one, and some more serious like the stories when you meet the Uyghurs later in the book. And they'll see that you're really using, as you mentioned earlier, food as a platform from which to explore and report. So it's a very very rich and meaty books here. We're full of the puns today. A very rich and meaty book. So thank you for reading that.
My pleasure.
So where can listeners find you online?
I'm quite chatty on Twitter. I love Twitter. That's my social media of choice, and I'm at Eden Travels. I'm also on Instagram under the same handle. And I have a website, www.carolineeden.com.
Very good. Thank you so much. And we're recording this in December 2020, so I wish you and your family have a very safe and happy holidays.
Thank you, Jeremy, and to you.
You can find the episode show notes and much more at travelwritingworld.com. please remember to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app. And if you find the show valuable, please consider leaving a review or supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at travelwritingworld.com/support.